Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 167. We are so glad that you've joined us. Before we get started, could you do me a favor and subscribe to our YouTube channel, either before or after you view this lesson? It would really help us to spread lessons like these to others, and so we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. Last week, we concluded last week's study of the 10 ways that Genesis 1 is interpreted by looking at the fifth theory, which is the dependent clause view. The sixth theory, and we did mention last week that these theories get a little bit more complex to explain, and I hope that last week's was simple enough but deep enough to understand the difference between the independent view and the dependent view. If not, you can go back there and look at it again. The sixth theory on our list is the gap theory. The gap theory teaches that between Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and Genesis 1:2, and the earth was without form and void, and the water was on the face of the deep, that's verse 2, that between those two verses is a gap of billions of years. During this time, according to this theory, Satan rebelled against God and was cast down to the earth, which led to its becoming a dark, watery chaos. After which, in verse 3, God began recreating the heavens and the earth with the creation of light. And this is why this theory is also called the ruin and reconstruction theory. One of the most important differences between this and other theories is how it translates verse 2. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2 says, according to this theory, and the earth became without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So according to the gap theory, verse 1 records the creation of the original heavens and earth. According to verse 2, between verse 1 and between the beginning of verse 2 is a gap when Satan rebelled and the earth became, in verse 2, a watery chaos. Verse 3 begins the recreation of the universe, the heavens and the earth, with the creation of light. Now, of the 7 assumptions that we've looked at, then by the way, this theory was quite popular. It's not as popular as it used to be, but it was quite popular about 50 to 75 years ago. And there's a lot of material out there, but you'd have to look a little bit harder to find it than some of the more modern theories. Now, of the 7 assumptions that we've looked at in this series, the gap theory assumes that there's a God. It assumes theism. It assumes an old universe. This is the reason for putting the gap between verse 1 and verse 2 to allow the text, to make the text stretchable to fit in billions of years. It also assumes prose over poetry as the literary style of Genesis, because after the gap, we have a literal 7 days of recreation. Then we have to look at the assumption that it makes about creation itself. It assumes sudden creation versus incrementalism. So God created the heavens and the earth. Suddenly, it was thrown into a watery chaos with the fall of Satan. Suddenly, and with the creation of light, it's suddenly beginning to be recreated again. It also assumes design, that God is involved in the design and the creation of the universe. And finally, that we gain truth by observation and revelation, and objective truth exists. So we've been looking at these theories, basically what they believe and the assumptions they bring into the text. Now, at the end of this series, we're going to do a comparative chart of all these 10 and these 10 ways that Genesis 1 is interpreted, and look at the assumptions to show on a chart how they compare. And that will be eye-opening when we look at them, because it really begins to show us some things. But we'll do that in a few weeks. Now, the 7th way that Genesis 1 is interpreted is called the function theory. The basic idea of this one is that Genesis 1 describes how God made the world functional like an ancient temple. The main thesis being that the material creation is not what's being discussed or focused upon in the Genesis 1 account. The 7 days of creation are describing how God brought order to the heavens and the earth so that they can function as a temple from where God could rule. As John Walton, one of the most popular writers on this theory, and also an interpreter for as one who contributes to the NIV Study Bible, he's a very prominent scholar. He writes in The Lost World of Genesis 1, he says, in this book, I propose that people in the ancient world believed that something existed not by the virtue of its material properties, but by the virtue of its having a function in an ordered system. And so what he's explaining there is that this view is focused more on order than on the creation of order, and not on material creation. Now, the key verse in this theory, in the function theory, that God is just creating the world to be ordered enough to function as His temple, is not Genesis 1 verses 1 through 2, but actually Genesis 2 verses 1 and 2. It says, thus the heavens and the earth and all the hosts of them were finished. and by definition of this theory is able to function as a temple for God. And on the seventh day, we're back to Bible again, on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done, and he rested from all his work which he had done. In the function theory, God resting from his work on the seventh day is seen as a deity resting in an ancient temple. Resting meant that they ruled from the temple that was created, and this is how this theory sees God resting from his work on the creation week. Now, when this takes place, or when this took place, is not really important in this theory, the function theory. The actual length of the 7 days, whether they're literal 7 days or ages of time, is really not important at all to this theory. What's important to this theory is that God ordered the universe so that he could rule it from the earth, from the heavens, as his temple. This theory assumes God exists. It assumes theism. It assumes an old universe, but it doesn't struggle with the idea of a young universe, because in this theory, in the function theory, it doesn't matter. What matters is the order of creation, but it does lend itself to an old universe. The third assumption is that the text is basically poetic. That means it's stretchable, not to be taken in a wooden literalism. Fourthly, it also believes in supernatural creation and incremental creation. It kind of brings those two together. It also holds that the universe is designed, it's not accidental or self-existing, that God's involved in somehow in bringing the order to the universe, but it just doesn't speak to, that the text, according to this theory, doesn't speak to. Genesis 1 does not speak to material creation, it speaks to the order of creation. And then we also see that it believes in getting our information from both observation, science, and scripture, revelation. And finally, that objective truth exists. This brings us to our eighth way that Genesis 1 is understood, and that's the progressive creation theory. This view is one of the most popular, if not the most popular today. Like the day-age theory, it holds that the days of the creation week of Genesis 1 are long periods of time. However, it doesn't believe in macroevolution as the process used by God in creation. It holds rather that God created everything over long periods of time, but that God created certain types of animals, and then they died out, and then God created more animals, and they died out, and eventually he got around to creating humanity. So while it doesn't take an exact Darwinian view, it's kind of similar in some of its beliefs. Now, this theory assumes that God exists. It assumes in theism. It assumes that the universe is old, billions of years. It assumes that the literature in Genesis 1 is poetic, that it's stretchable and you can work with it, and it's not to be taken in the exact way it's written. It also believes in supernatural creation, but it also believes in incremental creation. It kind of mixes the two. It holds that the universe is designed and not accidental or self-existing. It assumes that we get information through our observation, through our eyes and experience, as well as revelation, science and scripture. And it also assumes that objective truth exists. Now, this concludes the 8 theories that hold to an old universe. All 8 of the theories we've looked at so far believe in an old universe. Now, looking at all 8, we can begin to look at some similarities and differences in these. So they're not, even though they all hold to an old universe, they don't agree on all the other assumptions, and we're going to compare them at the end of this series. Next week, we're going to look at the 2 young Earth theories, and then we'll follow that with a comparison of all 10. If this lesson has helped you, please share it with a friend, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or check out our Sunday morning live podcast on either Apple or Spotify. I hope to see you next week.